Welcome back to Here with Goldberg. Today I'll be talking about what happened in 1971 and the gold standard. I'm sure at some point you've seen that commercial of the boomer going, "They've always done right by me." Or better yet, the statement, gold's got intrinsic value, which always makes me chuckle because anything you're going to use as a means of exchange or to store value, there has to be a generalized acceptance perception that it possesses said value. So you could be an arch libertarian crypto guru, but if you see a $100 bill on the sidewalk, unless you think it's a trap to get you to bend over so they can steal your shoes or make merriment with another part of your person, you're going to recognize, oh, well, this is some benefit to me. You wouldn't say the same about the Zimbabwean paper currency or something from Haiti because that doesn't possess identical status. Now, the gold bugs would push back and say gold has the benefit of you can create something with it, it can be a component. And at least in theory, if you have your money backed by gold, it restricts the ability of the state to print, cause runaway inflation, inject stimulus, artificial growth, that sort of thing. They are conditioned by how much gold they possess or what can be mined and produced, unless you want to go in the realm of alchemy. And by the way, one of the first alchemists was a certain Maria of Alexandria, a Care Bear woman, so that's something to look into. It should be noted, however, that historically gold has been devalued and it has been manipulated. This book, which I'll put a link to, has a nice summary of the history. Nonetheless, gold bucks would maintain it's a better system for the vast majority of people because it puts some brakes on the worst impulses of politicians and central banks. This has to be balanced with the reality, of course, that you are better off with the gold standard if you have a lot of gold. If you don't possess much gold, it can wreak havoc or it can be an incentive for conflicts to occur over gold. And this has been manifested throughout history of human civilization. In the 1870s, you have the Franco-Prussian War. The French were required to pay an indemnity of 5 billion gold francs, and the tables were turned sometime later after Versailles when the German Empire had this foisted upon them of massive reparations in gold, which more or less destroyed their currency at a rapid click. And it was essentially worthless. The state under the Weimar, they were printing tons of money, not only to cover the debts, but also to provide something in the form of work creation, public services. So with the Schatz and a Mustache Man, what they did is they had to come up with a means of attracting investment towards their debt, I believe. So they had to create these notes that were backed in some sense by the productivity of the economy. It was called The Magic of Money, which the gentleman Schott, he wrote a book on it. You can find it online. It's pretty interesting. I've read it. Another example would be Muammar Gaddafi, and it's believed he was trying to create a dinar backed by gold. All of a sudden, pro-democracy revolution. Where did the massive Libyan gold reserves go? It's a good question. Where did General Yamashita's gold go to? Another great query. So that's a measure of probably healthy conspiracy mixed into the whole equation. But going back to the late 1800s in the United States, there were these financial panics. People were saying, how do you stabilize currency? And there were the greenbacks who said, paper money backed by the faith and credit of the US, that's all you need. The gold bugs who said, no, go to the gold standard. You had a small movement of those who wanted paper money backed by the value of land. And then, of course, William Jennings Bryan, the populists, the free silver movements. These were predominantly farmers who felt that under the gold standard, debt was more expensive. With gold, there's a tendency towards deflation. That means that the value of your money goes up, prices fall. But in the case of the farmers, they didn't really appreciate it. So they said if you create bimetallism, you incorporate silver into the support for currency, there's a lot more of it, it's cheaper, so you can expand the amount of money in circulation. It might benefit crop prices, but it should make the debt improve as far as like it will become cheaper. William Jennings Bryan was not successful, ran for president 3 times, never got into power. He became famous later on as Secretary of State and then in the Scopes monkey trial, but that's a separate matter. The gold bugs were triumphant to an extent. However, as it turned out, with the Federal Reserve, They were not observing the gold standard to the letter, and so the currency did in fact grow, expand. The money supply went up at least 100% in a short period after the triumph of the gold types, and it was not beneficial to the farmers, despite what they believed. The popular talking point against the gold standard, typically from leftists, which says if you have an economic collapse, the state is restrained from printing more money, prevents them from doing stimulus, making jobs up, and so it's going to prolong that downturn. So in case of the Great Depression, this is one of the arguments for why FDR wanted to go off the gold standard and actually seize the gold held by people, which doesn't quite make sense. You want to get off the gold standard, but then you want everyone's gold. I wonder why that might be. Now, we maintain some measure of the gold standard, but then in 1971, it goes the other way. Nixon takes us off, and this website is one of the most popular in libertarian circles. So I'm going to go through some of the stats here and then give some commentary. Productivity up 246% since 1948, but wages only 115%. So there seems to be a mismatch there. Income gains widely shared in post-war decades, but not since then. Remember too, and I'm not trying to be, a Bernie booty boy, but there were also differences in tax rates as well. There was a stronger union-backed economy, and these are things that sometimes these people, they want to attribute it strictly to gold and that policy, which I think it's related, but there's a lot of different factors that have to be addressed. I mean, remember what happened in the 1970s that was really crucial. Well, you have Nixon goes to China, Yogi goes to Grindr. These are momentous occurrences, and once you open up trade, a lot of people realize, well, shoot, we can import cheap stuff from Asia and we can outsource. So that's another factor when you're talking about what's happened to incomes, the relative security of people, how they're living their lives. It's not just the gold standard, to be clear. Income growth from 1917 to 2012, as you can see, for the top 1%, it has been a steady rise, but it's somewhat flatlined for the bottom 90%. Is that just because of going off the gold standard, or is it also due to factors such as trade policies, tax rates? All these things have to be incorporated. 50-year decline in wages. That does make sense, of course, that if you don't have much in the way of deflation, I think in that entire period they said it was only a very small blip where you've had deflation. And so you continuously are expanding the money supply, which is probably going to devalue your wages and how far your dollar can go. Income concentration in the top has risen sharply. GDP per capita versus male income. Female income. America has become a nation of dual income working couples. This is also something that requires a bit more unpacking. So I remember in the manosphere at a certain point, everyone started using this claim, well, once you double the labor supply by bringing women in, that depresses male wages. And I was trying to figure out who was saying this. Well, it came out to be Dr. Lobster, who's like, you see what you do is you bring all these women in, and suddenly men are making less money. And that's just actually kind of a Marxist critique, strangely enough, because it implies that the economy has this kind of ceiling where it's not going to go beyond that. Where if you're an actual free market or neoliberal or libertarian, you believe that growth will continue, the economy will expand. So let me give you a couple of figures before we return to this page. Here we have GDP of the United States, 1960. It's 543.3 billion or 30 billion, and per capita 3,000. Here is 25 trillion, 76,000 per capita. Part of that obviously is based upon increased money circulation, but the economy is expanding. So pretending that you could keep women out of the economy perpetually, and it's just going to remain large enough for men to have single income households is a little bit naive from my perspective. In addition, you have the federal budget. So 1960, it's 92,000 million, and you come up here and it's 6 trillion. So that shows you the magnitude. Again, more money in circulation, money being printed, but it's also reflection of an expansion among a variety of things. population. So we have 341 million today, 2024. If we go back to 1960, it was 176 million. So that's a pretty substantial increase in your population, and that means the economy is going to get larger. I always tell people when they use the Jordan Peterson line, think of like Ulta Beauty. That would not be such a tremendously successful stock. It wouldn't be a large, prosperous company were it not for women having their own ability to pay and to be consumers. So it was obvious people, and this was already starting in the 20s and 30s, which were very degenerate. I covered that trend towards feminism in the Black Pill book if you want to check it out. But what really kind of brought it back to some measure of normalcy was the Great Depression, then the war. Men were killed off. Women had to be a little bit more trad and feminine to attract partners. But you get to the 1960s, there's this big push to get women involved because they knew that women could be sold almost anything. In fact, a lot of the ads were still targeting women, even if it was about trying to please men. But gradually, like, well, shoot, we can really grift off of women effectively. You also have it was a Catholic, a Chinese dude, and two Care Bears were the ones that came up with the birth control pills. So that's another factor. Women are no longer tied down to, oh, they're going to have a baby. They have economic opportunities. Why would they want to just be in a house being taken care of by a man? They can extend out their period of just having their fun and buying what they want. Another instance of this would be Victoria's Secret. That was a very successful company, and you make millions of dollars, and then you jump off a bridge. It's brutal. But my point is, be careful about trying to attribute it to one singular factor. It's good to call people's attention as like a sort of a milestone or whatever, but it's not all inclusive. All right, you see inflation has gone up substantially, especially since the 1970s. House prices and rents indexed. How long does it take to save for a house? So this is a big discussion currently on X of housing prices, and they say, oh, you got to build more. And usually the accounts I see promoting building more housing are curry cells for whatever reason. I wonder why. You have to factor that in too with the population growth is all the migration. 1965, that was disastrous, but really more so. H.W. Bush was not a terrible president, but his worst thing was the 1990 Immigration Act. That was disastrous, even more so than what it built on, which was 1965. So that's a big factor because more people are moving in, and communities that traditionally wanted to limit growth because they want to maintain a feel, a look, housing prices get exacerbated. At the same time, as the government's getting more involved in the economy, you have these contracting positions, more government bureaucracies people are working for. That accelerates the rise in prices to a great degree. Home value change versus income change. That is pretty brutal to look at. Peer review in Google Books. I guess that's suggesting more intellectualism, potentially. Currency crashes. Banking crises, increasing federal debts. Well, yeah, we knew that much. You have to work more to buy the S&P. The savings rate has collapsed, which makes sense, especially as they've been cutting interest rates. There's no incentive to be saving, and deregulation of the credit card industry. So live while you can because there's no tomorrow. Parties becoming more partisan, more polarized. Yeah, it's true. When you have times of uncertainty, instability, when people are doing worse off economically, there's a tendency towards extreme politics. I definitely think that can be tracked. It's not to say that it was some kind of rainbows and sunshine in the past, but as I pointed out many times, it's very rare you have an election where there's a decisive victory for a candidate anymore. It's almost always close to 50% of the population is opposed to whoever's being taking the presidency, and that says a lot. Federal Register number of pages skyrockets. That was an inevitability. I think that would have occurred just because of population growth. It's unlikely you're going to have a massive population in a super small government, but definitely a government is out of control. More young adults living with their parents. We all know about that. Median age of first marriage has gone up. And once again, that is not just the gold standard, that's a lot of other factors, which, as I said, birth control, female empowerment, women having the choice to begin with, because a lot of women got married back in the day because it was an economic necessity. Otherwise, they were going to be stuck in their parents' house forever. Declining fertility. Well, once more, that's changing in industries and changing in lifestyles because you would have more kids in the past because you didn't have birth control. And also, if you were in a rural setting, you needed cheap labor. Increased health expenditures, growth of physicians and administrators. I do want to point out Nixon was the guy that did a lot to expand cancer research. So I wonder if that's a factor in the sense that how much care would you get if you developed cancer in the 1950s and 60s? I have heard boomers tell me, oh, if it wasn't for Nixon, I would have died of cancer, something like that. Make of it what you will. More vegetable oil production. Yeah, I do think that's a factor. People say it's conspiracy theory, but why is there soybean, canola oil in pretty much everything? I swear to God, even health food stores, they put that stuff in everything as opposed to like olive oil or even, coconut oil. I mean, it really makes you wonder at some point. I think that stuff does bad to your insides. That's my theory. I'm not a scientist, so you don't have to believe me. Meat consumption, chicken has skyrocketed, and less beef. Okay, so you could call it's a cluckspiracy. But that might be in part. I know like Hispanics, I think their staple is chicken typically. And then if you're talking about curry cells, obviously they can't eat cows. I wonder with beef, if you had this population growth to begin with, could you actually sustain people eating a lot of beef grown naturally or raised naturally, I should say? I feel like you would have to bioengineer it at this scale. It'd be very difficult to provide that in an actually healthy, authentic manner, even in general, any foods. Because that's the other factor you have to keep in mind. Since the 1970s explosion of GMOs, the use of lots more pesticides, enhancements, and all that sort of thing, because it's a better way of guaranteeing outcome. If you took away all the emulsifiers, all the preservatives, all the bioengineered foods, I don't think you could feed all the people in this country effectively. I'm pretty sure you would have some form of starvation. And you have the popular claim that red meat kills. It's hard because even some people that are advocating eating clean and being natural, even some of them, you'll say, well, yeah, don't touch red meat too much. So it's difficult to know who to believe. I personally, the one thing I do disagree with is the OMG cholesterol, don't have eggs. Hell no. I'm up to like 3 eggs a day. I really want to expand that. I can't eat cooked eggs, they disgust me, but I do have them like in shakes, just raw. And not only is that a good source of cheap protein, but it is a nice enhancer, if you know what I mean. So that's something to keep in mind. So ultimately, what do you take away from all these graphs and memes? I've said it so many times, and I might, who knows, maybe I'm going to have to get involved in politics because I'm so sick of these imbeciles running around and saying things that are totally contradictory. You have to make the economy, you have to make corporations servants of the state, and the state, of course, advocating for the best interests of the people. That means families, middle and working class. I know that seems like a pipe dream, but it certainly can be done better. And I see a lot of people, even the ones that will push this type of, these memes and graphs, they will simp for the elites so much. There's a tendency in right wing circles to devolve into this kind of economic Darwinism where you believe yeah, the strong survive, but it ends up being very distorted because you see that the strong increasingly are these corrupt neoliberals. They're central bank printing people. They are not individuals that necessarily embody anything about, working harder than everyone else, out competing. They're just degenerates and they're parasites in many respects. So you have to recognize that. And I would say it's very likely going to have to cross party lines, but especially the right wing should be the ones that start, trumpeting it. You cannot gain control of the economy and make it better for the vast majority of people with this sort of every man for himself mentality. So ultimately, you have to believe in a strong, competent approach to bringing these institutions in line. And it has been done before. It has been done by some states, by some regimes. The question is it going to be regular people that went out, or are they just going to continue being turned into gradually into these economic slaves? Let me know what your thoughts are on WTF happened in 1971.